Good morning. So we're working on the Monitaur. We're working with Dapper today. We're implementing our SQL queries for the remainder of the methods that we've already added to the data access layer. The way Dapper works is it's a light ORM. It just maps your models in the database to strongly typed models. But you have to use it with regular SQL queries. One thing that we did yesterday is we made a unit of work, so that way we have transactions. We can have multiple transactions in one commit. And now we're just adding the remainder of the SQL strings. So here in this one, if we're going to read my user connection, and it's just one by this ID, then we're going to do a var SQL equals, and we're going to do a select. And it's the first one from our dbo.application users connections as C. And then we also want to say in here that I only want to do this where my C.id is equal to this ID to string, and your C.active is equal to true. Okay, and now we've got to run the query. So it's going to be a entity equals await my unit of work dot connection dot query asynchronous, and we're going to query our SQL, and then we're going to pass in a transaction here, which is my unit of work dot transaction. And we only want to get the first or default of this. And so now if my entity does not equal to null, then we're going to return a mapper.map to my application user connection DTO of my entity. Otherwise, I just want to return null, and this can be conditional. Looks right. Okay, this one, it's almost the exact same thing, except it's for connection ID. So we're just going to change this to be connection ID and connection ID. This next one here is a create. So these are a little bit different for the query. The create looks like this. var SQL equals, and it's going to be a insert into dbo.application users connections, and now we need to select the columns that we're going to input, which we can say are application user ID, connection ID is online, and has ping been sent. And then we also want to say that we're going to insert the values here of my application user connection ID is online and has ping been sent. And then we need to execute this. So we're going to say, first thing that we need to do is have a entity here, which is mapped from my request And then we need to set the ID property of that equals to my unit of work dot connection dot execute asynchronous. That's going to be my SQL, my entity, and then the transaction here is the unit of work dot transaction. We're going to increase our counter because we're adding one, and then we're going to return my mapper.map of my application user connection of the DTO of the entity. And that's our create. Now this doesn't actually work. And the reason for that is the way is what's happening with transactions. So SQL doesn't let me do deferred constraints. SQL Server. So what I mean by that is that if I created a user and then I created this connection in the same transaction, it's going to fail because it's going to tell me that it doesn't have that foreign key available. So it's not so much a hack because we're doing it all in one transaction, but what I can do is I can issue just a couple more SQL statements, and we're going to do an alter table. And it's going to be my application users connections. And what we're going to do here is turn off our constraint that we created here. This one. Looks like that. But now we actually have to do one more thing where we enable it back right after we do the insert. And all this one is check constraint, like that. And that's our create. Now we don't have that problem on the update because if we're updating it, then it's already been in the data set. What do you think about that? If we're doing an update, it's already got to be written to the database. If it's a transaction, you wouldn't be able to update it because it hasn't written the create. And we don't see transactional data, which is really annoying. So what we're going to do here is we're going to do the same thing where we do our, I want to get the entity. Just a second. In this one, all we're going to do is a try and a catch. And our SQL here is going to be update dbo dot application users connections, and we want to set is online to is online. Has ping been set to has ping been sent. Where my ID equals ID and my active equals true. And then we're going to do an await on this and do a connection dot execute asynchronous of the SQL and our request, which maps to our parameters, and then our unit of work dot transaction. We're going to increase our counter and do a return true. And if not, then we'll do a return false. Now the last one, this delete, is pretty straightforward. It's almost exactly the same, except we're setting active here to false. and then you're going to execute this with your ID. And you can't forget that this needs to be a transaction here, like that. And that's it. We have one more set to do, which are our projects. So let's do that. So this first one here is where we're going to use to read our projects. Select everything from projects. Where my application user ID equals application user ID and it's active. And then we're going to map this to my project DTO and return it. Okay, the next one is read one project. We'll add that in there. Select the top one from projects where my ID equals that and my c.application user ID equals your application user ID.toString and it's active. And then if that works, you're going to convert that to be a project DTO. Okay, you have one here for the create. Now we have to do the same thing with this alter table. So this one is going to be a project DTO that we're mapping it to. We're not checking the constraint for projects application users. Insert into projects. We're going to insert we have application user ID, project name, and project description. And then we're going to execute this and convert this over to be a project DTO. Okay, our update is pretty straightforward. Update projects and we're going to set my project name and project description. And we're going to set that where my ID is that and it's active. And then we're going to pass in my request. And you also want to say, and your application user ID is equal to application user ID.toString. Okay, and this last one is our delete, which is the same thing except for we're just setting active to be false. And then this one, we're going to make it a new anonymous class, and we're going to add in here the ID and our application user ID. Okay, the last two that we have here are for our logs. So for this one, our SQL is going to be similar to the create, because we may or may not have created our user at this point. So in this case, we're going to alter our table called log APIs, and we're going to not check our constraint against application users. And then we'll re-enable it. And then into log APIs, what we're going to add here is application user ID, just a second. This is wrong. Your log API has one here. So over on init, you can get rid of this one. So we're going to have application user ID, endpoint type value, response code, and IP address. And then we're going to pass in endpoint type value, response code, and IP address. And then here you're going to set your log ID, and you're going to pass in here the log like that, and then you're going to just return the log. This is the same thing, except it's going to be on log errors to log APIs. And so now when we insert this into log errors, all we're going to have is the log API ID and the exception. And that's it. So that's all of our SQL queries there. Let's go ahead and rebuild this. And if I jump into the SQL project, we're going to delete the database and reload it. Okay. And then over in our migrations project, since we're using Fluent Migrations, we'll just run this. And now we can run our project. On our web app, we want to do an ng serve. And then we're going to take a look here at application users. Give this thing a little kick. Interesting. It says home component is not defined in your app routing module. Okay, so here we go. We're going to check to see that everything creates successfully. Our entity is null. We're going to create our application user, and we do. Now, when I read the connection, it says incorrect syntax. Okay, let's try it again. It's in that one, this read. Just a second. Is it called connection ID? So this is one of the nice things that we can do here, is that it's called connection ID as string. Is that now I can just select this and dump it over into SQL Server. Incorrect sequence name near DBO. Let's try this one. Oh, I see what the problem is. It's from. Which means we need to make those modifications on this other read. And we can run it again. This time it kicks through. It doesn't find the connection. We're going to create the connection. Now it's failing here. application user ID right there. Try it again. That time it created the connection. We're going to write the log, and it's going to say that failed. Like that. And if we look, because this is all done in a transaction, the whole thing should have failed, and it did. And then we write the log, we make the commit, and everything works. We go to client applications. We're going to get my user, which worked. We're going to read the projects, which we have 0. We're going to commit it and return it. Okay, so we're in pretty good shape here. And now all of our entities are set up. So the next step is that we need to actually create our first web UI component here for our client applications. And we're going to do it for projects first. So if I look at the web app, we have something here called projects. My routing module is sending me to projects, which is right there. And so projects needs to have some HTML on it. So what I want to do is I want to first have a map card for my container. And I'm going to call this my class is my projects container. What is going on? This is so peculiar. I gotta close this and reopen it. That's bizarre. And now I want to have in here something called ngx loading. And we're going to say that this is a show equals my loading, just like that. And then we're going to have another mat card, and we're going to call this with a mat card title. And I'm going to say that this is my projects. And then what we're going to need is a map form field. And then what I want to do is have my, I guess I don't need that. I just want to have my mat card content. And inside of content, what I want to have is a table. And we're going to say that this is only going to be if my projects.length is greater than 0. And we're going to call it a mat table. It's going to be mat sortable. We're going to give it a data source here of data source. And the class for the way that it looks will be mat elevation z8. So on the TS, we need two things. The first one is loading, which is a Boolean. And we need one called data source, which is a, and then we need one called projects. So now I need to have my individual fields on it. So that's in something called an ng container. And the column definition is project name. And then we're going to have a header here, which is called a mat header cell. And it's going to have a reference called the mat header cell def. And this is a mat sort header. And all this thing is going to say is a well, this is for the head. So this one we can say project name. And then for the body of it, we need this to say mat cell. And then a mat cell definition is let element. And then we're going to do our element.project name. We do that again for the project description. And then at the bottom of this, before table, we need to have my mat header row called mat header row definition equals your displayed columns. And then you also want to have your mat row, which is your mat row definition, equals let row columns displayed columns. And then underneath the table, we're going to have the mat paginator. And we're going to say your page size options here are going to be 5, 10, or 20. We want to say show first, last buttons, and my class will be table paginator. And that's it. So when I look at the TypeScript, we need to have a couple of things. The first one is a view child up here for my mat paginator, which we're going to call paginator. We need another @view child of the mat sort, which is called a sort. understand what is happening here. Something is totally weird happening with my TypeScript. Anyways, we're going to add back in those two things that I just had. My data source here is a new mat table data source of my type called iProject. So on an init, you want to do this dot loading equals true. You're going to say this dot loading equals false. This dot projects equals projects. Okay, we also need to say when we do this that this dot data source dot sort equals this dot sort. I need to do this dot data source dot paginator equals this dot paginator. And then this dot data source dot data equals this dot projects. And then finally we'll add our two fields here for mat sort, mat paginator. It's like a different version of Angular. Because options is no longer, okay, we'll have to look at what that wants. And the only other thing that we need in here is that array called displayed columns. And that's just going to be an array of strings. And we have project name and project description. And we also want to have one more row in here called remove. And over in here, we need to have the delete button. So we can add one more. Call it remove. This one is a header cell and the cell definition, but no sort. We're going to say remove project. And then in here, we're going to have a button, which will be mat primary. My color will be primary. My type will be a button. My ID will be remove project. I don't think I need that one. We're going to have a mat stroked button. And then we want to say the click event is remove project, and we're going to pass the element.id. Okay. The next thing that I want to do is take a look here, and we want to say view child Angular example. Just a second, I'll be right there. Okay, give me 1 second, guys. All right, I'm back with you. Sorry about that. So what it looks like here is that we've got 3 parameters in here. True to resolve query results before change detection runs. So here we can do a static, and we could say false. And so now when we look back here at our app, we click on Client Applications. It doesn't appear to be navigating me over to projects. Let's just do this one more time. Okay, give it a second for everything to load here. Log in. It's not kicking me over anymore. Why would it not be doing that? I mean, that worked. So why is it failing? Here we go. Can't bind to show because it doesn't have NGX loading. So let's add NGX loading. We just do an npm install ngx loading. Says it's not called show anymore. Oh, because you need to add this here in your ngx loading module .for root. And we're going to instead put that here on my shared module in components. And then we want to import ngx loading module from ngx loading. I guess we also want to have that as an export. MAC card title is not a known element. So in this one, we want to import my shared module. So now I can remove this and add this back to components module. ngx loading module .for root of this. Okay, browser module has already been loaded. That means that this can go away. And that's because this is lazy loaded, so a second. It's because it's lazy loaded. Because it's lazy loading it, and then it's got it in it again. Well, let me think about that. I'm out of time for the day. Thank you for staying with me this morning. If you have any questions, make sure you put them into our Discord, discord.pixelhorrorstudios.com. Also put these videos up at youtube.pixelhorrorstudios.com. I'll try to come back later tonight, maybe like at 6 o'clock p.m. And thank you guys again for staying with me. I will see you a little bit later. Have a great rest of your morning. Alrighty. Bye, guys.